Why medieval food was the worst in history. Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to the Middle Ages. So go ahead, dim the lights, settle under the covers, and let your brain sink into that floaty space between curiosity and sleep. We'll be wandering through kitchens that smelled faintly of wood smoke, stale ale, and something that probably should not have been left out overnight. Because yes, tonight's gentle bedtime topic is food. Specifically, why medieval food was, by most modern measures, the absolute worst in history. And before you start picturing a quaint banquet with roast pheasants and golden goblets, remember, those banquets were rare. They were more like special effects in a movie. The day-to-day menu was less Game of Thrones feast and more sad beige gruel. Let's ease into this slowly. Imagine being born in, say, 1320. You've arrived in a village somewhere in France, or maybe a damp corner of England. Your parents are farmers. Congratulations. This means your daily meals are going to revolve around one main dish, pottage. Pottage was the culinary equivalent of a shrug. You took whatever you had, grains, beans, scraps of vegetables, and simmered it in a pot of water until it surrendered to a vague mush. Sometimes, if the stars aligned, you threw in a bit of bacon fat, which made it a real treat. And if the stars didn't align, congratulations again. You just had warm gray paste. It's worth noting that medieval people didn't really care much about flavor in the modern sense. They cared about survival. They weren't so much asking, "Does this taste good?" as, "Will this keep me alive through February?" And the answer was often, "Maybe, but you'll also get scurvy." Bread was the other staple. Sounds good, right? Except, the bread often contained more than just flour. Millers weren't exactly fussy about purity. You'd get bits of husk, stray pebbles, and occasionally ground-up insects baked right in. It was the kind of bread that doubled as dental insurance, because after a few years of chewing it, you didn't have any teeth left to worry about. And for the record, white bread, made from refined flour, was considered the fancy stuff. Only the wealthy got that. Everyone else got rye bread. Dense, dark, and occasionally hallucinogenic, thanks to a delightful fungus called ergot. Imagine being hungry, taking a big bite of rye bread, and suddenly thinking you were on a pilgrimage with glowing saints. That's not divine intervention. That's food poisoning. Now, let's wander into the castle kitchens, because surely the nobility ate better, right? Well, yes and no. They certainly had more variety, but that doesn't mean it was good variety. Royal. Banquets were displays of wealth more than culinary skill. You'd find roasted swans, peacocks with their feathers reattached for aesthetic flair, and pies that sometimes contained live birds, so that when cut open, they would fly out. In a sort of medieval stage trick, it sounds whimsical. It was mostly cruel. The meat itself was usually overcooked, partly to cover up the fact that it wasn't exactly fresh. Spices like pepper, cinnamon, and cloves were used in excessive amounts, not so much for taste, but to hide the flavor of slightly questionable meat. Picture gnawing on a drumstick that tastes faintly of clove cigarettes. That was dinner. And sugar? That was considered a spice too, which means it showed up in strange places, like being sprinkled over roasted fish. Imagine a salmon with a dusting of sugar and cinnamon. That's not dessert, that's medieval cuisine. The aristocracy also had a fondness for sauces, not delicate reductions, but thick, gloopy concoctions of vinegar, breadcrumbs, and wine, heavily spiced, poured over everything. They looked like someone had knocked over a cauldron of wet plaster. One contemporary recipe literally calls for grinding almonds into a paste, mixing it with wine, and then pouring it over boiled chicken, which does not sound entirely terrible, until you realize the almonds were probably rancid, and the wine had turned to vinegar. Let's pause for a moment and drift to the royal obsession with fasting, because the medieval church loved to remind everyone that eating too much meat was sinful. There were dozens of fasting days each year when meat was forbidden. Fish was the substitute. But fish preservation wasn't exactly cutting edge. You either salted it within an inch of its life or dried it until it resembled a plank of wood. The wealthy sometimes had freshwater fish ponds, carefully stocked so they could show off on Fridays. The poor? They got pickled herring. Lots and lots of pickled herring. Imagine every Friday for your entire life someone plunking down a plate of salty gray fish in front of you. It's enough to make Lent feel eternal. Milk and dairy products existed, but milk was considered a food for children and the sick. Adults mostly avoided it, possibly because it spoiled in about 6 minutes without refrigeration. Cheese and butter were safer, though cheese in particular often leaned toward the experimental category. Some cheeses hardened into something, closer to a building material than a food. Others went slimy in mysterious ways. It was a gamble every time. And eggs? Perfectly fine. But if you were poor, you didn't get many. You needed your chickens alive for more eggs later. If you were rich, you put them into custards thickened with breadcrumbs, flavored with rose water, and served them lukewarm, because temperature control was not a thing. Water, of course, wasn't always safe to drink, so people leaned heavily on ale. Low alcohol, weak ale, brewed constantly in households. Even children drank it. It was like slightly alcoholic cereal milk, cloudy and yeasty. Stronger ale was saved for special occasions, or for people who had already given up on their livers. Wine was more of a Southern European habit, though imported wine made its way north. It wasn't aged carefully in cellars with tasting notes. It was often sour, rough, and mixed with spices or honey to make it palatable. Medieval wine was basically just drinkable enough. Now let's drift gently toward the table manners, because you might think all of this was at least eaten with forks and knives. Except, forks weren't common until quite late. Most people ate with knives, spoons, and fingers. A thick slice of bread, called a trencher, served as your plate. After the meal, the trencher was either eaten or tossed to the dogs, which means your food absorbed a nice underlayer of stale bread juice before you got to the bottom. And remember, hand washing was not universal. People wiped their greasy fingers on tablecloths, on their clothes, or occasionally on the nearest servant. This was considered perfectly acceptable. The upper classes also dabbled in subtleties, elaborate sugar sculptures painted and shaped into castles, ships, or biblical scenes. These were mostly decorative. Guests admired them before they collapsed into sticky heaps. In theory, they were edible. In practice, they were like gnawing on a decorative candle. Of course, one of the biggest problems with medieval food wasn't what people ate, but when they didn't eat. Famine was a constant visitor. Bad harvests, floods, wars, suddenly the pottage pot was empty. And medieval people didn't understand nutrition in the way we do. They believed in the theory of humors, balancing bodily fluids with the right foods. If you had too much black bile, you needed something dry and hot, like roasted meat. Too much phlegm? Eat something dry and cold. It was like prescribing astrology as a diet plan. Unsurprisingly, it didn't always work. And so, we arrive at the conclusion that medieval food was, in a word, bleak. The wealthy smothered questionable meat in spices. The poor gnawed on gritty bread and prayed for spring. Everyone drank weak ale to forget about it, but in a way it suited the time. Meals weren't about pleasure. They were about survival, ritual, and showing off rank. The king's swan pie was a political statement. The peasant's bowl of porridge was a lifeline. Neither was particularly delicious. And as you drift toward sleep, you can be quietly grateful that your dinner probably did not contain ergot fungus, pickled herring, or a restuffed peacock, unless you're very unlucky. Let's drift gently onward into the next part of our story. The tragedy of Charles VI, the Mad King of France. Hey everyone! Welcome back. If you're still awake after medieval bread talk, congratulations. If you drifted off and are only now resuming, that's fine too. That's the whole point. Tonight, we're wandering into the life of Charles VI of France, a man sometimes called Charles the Beloved, later more famously, Charles the Mad. And yes, that's quite the downgrade. Let's drift into the late 14th century. France was not exactly in her golden age. The 100 Years' War with England was dragging on. The Black Death had done its charming work, trimming the population dramatically. The economy was fragile. The nobility was fractious. So, naturally, into this setting was born a king who would quite literally lose his mind. Charles VI was born in 1368, in Paris, the son of King Charles the Fickers, nicknamed the Wise, which already sets us up for disappointment. Being the son of the wise rarely ends well. It's like being asked to follow a brilliant stand-up comedian by reading tax codes out loud. When Charles II came to the throne at the tender age of 11, he was, of course, too young to rule, which meant his uncles got to step in as regents, always a recipe for disaster. The Duke of Burgundy, the Duke of Berry, and the Duke of Anjou took turns dipping their hands into the "you said, do not write hey everyone" section and ending section. Continue information from previous BT8 chat GPT said, got it. No soft hey everyone entry, no bedtime wrap-up at the end. I'll just continue flowing from the food discussion straight into Charles VI's story in the same tone. Here's Part 2, 1,700 words. Part 2, the tragedy of Charles VI, the Mad King of France. So while peasants gnawed on gritty bread and nobles politely poisoned themselves with sugar-coated fish, the French royal household was preparing a different kind of feast, one that involved politics, infighting, and a slow descent into madness. Charles VI was only 11 when his father, Charles V the Wise, died in 1380. And nothing says smooth political transition like a child monarch surrounded by power-hungry uncles. France had plenty of those. The Dukes of Burgundy, Berry, and Anjou quickly stepped in as regents, which mostly meant managing the kingdom's finances the way toddlers manage sandcastles, enthusiastically and with no regard for stability. They raised taxes to fund their own ambitions, squandered royal revenues, and generally left young Charles with the kind of government that was already wobbling before he even picked up the crown. When he reached the age of majority in 1388, Charles dismissed his uncles in favor of his father's old advisors, the so-called marmousets, who at least tried to stabilize things. For a brief window, it almost looked like France might be in competent hands. Almost. Charles was handsome, tall, athletic, and initially well-liked. People compared him to his wise father, and optimism bloomed. But optimism in medieval politics has about the same lifespan as unrefrigerated milk. By his mid-20s, cracks began to show. The first warning sign came in 1392. Charles, leading an army against a rebel in Brittany, suddenly had what modern historians would recognize as a psychotic break. Riding through a forest on a hot summer day, one of his squires accidentally dropped a lance with a clatter. The sound startled Charles so badly that he drew his sword and attacked his own companions. He killed several men before being restrained. Then he collapsed into a near catatonic state. This was not, as you can imagine, great for public confidence. Kings were supposed to smite enemies, not their own friends during a midday stroll. But Charles recovered somewhat, and people hoped it was an isolated incident. It was not. From then on, Charles suffered recurring episodes. He would forget his own name. He insisted he was made of glass and had to wear reinforced clothing so he wouldn't shatter. At times, he refused to bathe or change his clothes. On other occasions, he wandered the halls howling like an animal. Imagine living in the Louvre, still, functioning as a royal palace then, and finding the king crouched in a corner, refusing to be touched because he believed he might splinter into shards. Naturally, the court doctors had no real understanding of what was happening. They prescribed bloodletting, purges, and the usual medieval wellness package that was more likely to make matters worse. His episodes grew longer, his periods of lucidity shorter. By the 1390s, France had a king who was technically alive but functionally unreliable. This created a vacuum of power, and nature, especially medieval nature, hates a vacuum. His wife, Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, stepped in as regent. Unfortunately, she was not particularly respected. Foreign, lavish, rumored to have lovers among the dukes, her presence did little to stabilize the situation. The nobility split into factions. On one side were the Armagnacs, loyal to Isabeau and her allies. On the other, the Burgundians, led by the ambitious Dukes of Burgundy. The result was decades of civil conflict layered on top of the ongoing war with England. Because why settle for one disaster when you can enjoy two at once? One infamous episode, often called the Bal des Ardents, or the Ball of the Burning Men, illustrates the mixture of poor judgment and bad luck that haunted Charles's reign. In 1393, a masquerade ball was held to celebrate a noblewoman's remarriage. Charles, naturally, wanted to join in. He and several friends dressed up as wild men, wearing costumes made of linen soaked in pitch and covered in flax fibers. To complete the effect, they chained themselves together and danced around. This was going fine until Charles's brother Louis of Orléans entered the room carrying a torch, because of course he did. He got too close, and one of the wild men costumes ignited. The fire spread rapidly, turning the festive dance into a deadly inferno. 4 of the costumed nobles burned alive. Charles survived only because his aunt, the Duchess of Berry, threw her skirts over him to smother the flames. The people of Paris were not amused. Rumors spread that the royal family was cursed, frivolous, and possibly insane, which, to be fair, was not entirely wrong. Charles's mental instability also left his marriage in tatters. Isabeau initially supported him, but as his condition worsened, she distanced herself. She moved to her own residences, maintained her own court, and became a political force in her own right. The people, desperate for someone to blame, labeled her extravagant, immoral, and unfaithful. The image of the scheming, adulterous queen stuck to her in chroniclers' accounts, even if the reality was more complicated. Meanwhile, their children bore the weight of a fractured dynasty. The Dauphin, the heir apparent, kept dying, one after another. Between disease, stress, and misfortune, no son lasted long enough to secure a smooth succession. It was as if the crown itself carried a death wish. Eventually, the surviving heir was Charles VII, but by the time he reached maturity, France had already fractured beyond recognition. The Burgundians and Armagnacs descended into outright war. Paris itself was torn apart by riots and factional violence. At one point, the Burgundians literally hacked prominent Armagnac leaders to pieces in the streets, their corpses dragged through the city as a warning. All while the English, led by Henry V, looked across the Channel and thought, "This seems like a good time to invade." And invade they did. In 1415, Henry crushed the French at Agincourt, a battle immortalized in English propaganda and French humiliation. With the French monarchy paralyzed by Charles's illness and noble infighting, resistance was weak. By 1420, Isabeau and the Burgundians signed the Treaty of Troyes, disinheriting Charles's own son in favor of Henry IV of England. France's crown, at least on parchment, passed into English hands. The Dauphin Charles, future Charles VII, was declared illegitimate, which is one of those diplomatic maneuvers that looks clever in the short term but generally guarantees decades of bloodshed afterward. Charles VI lingered on, intermittently lucid, mostly broken until 1422. By the end, he was a tragic shell of the man who had once inspired such promise. When he died, the English claimed the French throne for Henry VI, an infant. But the Armagnac faction rallied around Charles VII instead. The 100 Years' War entered a new phase, with Joan of Arc eventually emerging to tip the balance. But Charles X's reign remains one of the grimmest in French history. not only because of his personal suffering, but because his illness crippled the monarchy at a time when unity was most needed. His madness became the stage on which noble rivalries, English ambitions, and dynastic chaos all played out. And so, while peasants prayed for better bread and nobles set themselves on fire at masquerades, France lived for decades under the rule of a king who thought he might shatter like glass. A reign both tragic and absurd, proving yet again that medieval monarchy was less a system of governance and more a long, badly written comedy sketch, occasionally drenched in kerosene. The Habsburg jaw and other dynastic oddities. Charles VI's reign left France fractured, and dynastic weakness always had a way of echoing across Europe. Nowhere was that more visible than in the House of Habsburg. If Charles was proof of how fragile a mind could be, the Habsburgs were proof of how fragile a face could become after too many generations of marrying your cousins. The Habsburgs began as minor nobles in what is now Switzerland and Austria. Through a patient combination of marriage contracts, treaties, and the occasional military grab, they climbed their way into ruling half of Europe. Their unofficial motto might as well have been, "Why fight a war when you can marry your way into a kingdom?" Which sounds clever, until you realize that after a few centuries of this, everyone in the family tree was also everyone else's second cousin. The result was what historians politely call the Habsburg jaw. Less politely, it was a protruding lower jaw so exaggerated that chewing, speaking, and even closing one's mouth became complicated tasks. The medical term is mandibular prognathism, but the dynastic term was inheritance. One of the earliest clear examples was Maximilian V, Holy Roman Emperor in the late 15th century. Maximilian was a clever politician and shrewd manager of dynastic marriages. He wed Mary of Burgundy, scooping up her territories, and arranged for his descendants to link into Spain. But look at portraits of him, and you'll see that distinctive jaw already making its debut. It got worse with each generation. By the time you reach Charles V, ruler of Spain and the Holy Roman Empire in the early 16th century, the jaw is undeniable. Charles could not fully close his mouth. His teeth didn't meet properly, which made eating messy and speaking unclear. Chroniclers remarked on his drooling, his awkward diction, and his constant jaw pain. But of course he was still emperor, which shows that bloodlines mattered far more than dental aesthetics. Charles V abdicated in exhaustion, dividing his vast domains between his son Philip II of Spain and his brother Ferdinand of Furs in Austria. That division kept the Habsburgs ruling, from both Madrid and Vienna, and both branches kept marrying within their own extended family, as though fresh genetic material were an optional luxury. Philip II, famous for the Spanish Armada and for ruling during Spain's so-called Golden Age, also carried the Habsburg jaw. He managed to marry 4 times, including to Queen Mary I of England. That union produced no children, which, given the family tendency toward fragile offspring, may have been a quiet blessing for the English line. As the Spanish Habsburg generations rolled on, the jaw worsened. By the time of Philip IV, in the early 17th century, painters like Velázquez could hardly avoid exaggerating the feature. Philip's lower lip jutted forward, his chin sloped oddly, and his face bore the unmistakable family stamp. The portraits from his court often tried to soften the look, but art can only do so much against heredity. And then came Charles II of Spain, the dynasty's most infamous product. If Charles VI of France symbolized madness, Charles II of Spain symbolized genetic collapse. He was born in 1661 to Philip IV and Mariana of Austria, who, not surprisingly, were uncle and niece. That made Charles the concentrated essence of Habsburg inbreeding. His jaw was so pronounced that he could barely chew. His tongue was too large for his mouth, causing constant drooling and unclear speech. His body was frail, his limbs weak, and his health precarious from birth. He suffered frequent seizures and intestinal problems, and while technically king from the age of 4, he never developed into a capable ruler. Court observers were not subtle. One described him as short, ill-formed, and ugly. Another remarked that his appearance was so grotesque that it astonished those who saw him for the first time. Physicians predicted early death repeatedly, yet Charles lingered into his late 30s, a figure both pitied and mocked. His reign was dominated by regents and advisors, as Charles himself was incapable of independent governance. Ministers and foreign powers maneuvered endlessly, aware that he was unlikely to produce heirs. He married twice, first to Marie-Louise of Orléans, then to Maria Anna of Neuburg. Both unions were childless. The blame fell predictably on Charles, whose health and infertility were obvious to everyone. Contemporaries whispered that he was bewitched. Witchcraft was a convenient explanation for his physical and mental fragility. In truth, the bewitchment was centuries of cousin marriages. His genetic coefficient of inbreeding, as modern biologists have calculated, was comparable to that of the child of a brother-sister union. In other words, the family tree had become more of a family wreath. Charles II died in 1700 at the age of 38. His death ended the Spanish Habsburg line. With no heirs, the crown passed by will to Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV of France, triggering the War of the Spanish Succession. Europe descended into another round of bloodshed, all because the most powerful dynasty in Europe had married itself into extinction. The Austrian branch of the Habsburgs fared slightly better, though the jaw remained a signature feature. Portraits of Leopold III, Holy Roman Emperor in the late 17th century, show an almost caricatured lower lip protruding like a ledge. Despite the look, Leopold married 3 times and produced a healthy number of children, which at least allowed his branch to continue. His descendants included Maria Theresa, who ruled the Habsburg lands in the 18th century. She was pragmatic, politically savvy, and determined to secure her dynasty's survival. She married her children strategically across Europe, Marie Antoinette to France, others to Naples, Parma, and beyond. By then, the Habsburg jaw was diluted enough to allow survival, though the genetic memory lingered. The irony of the Habsburg story lies in its contrast. They built their power on marriages. They called it diplomacy. They thought it brilliant. And in the short term, they acquired Burgundy, Spain, Austria, Bohemia, Hungary, and more, all through marital contracts. But over centuries, that same strategy devoured them from within. The dynasty ate its own health in exchange for thrones. The portraits remain as quiet testimony. Look at Charles V, Philip IV, Charles II. Each face is a reminder that political ambition can outpace biological wisdom. In their minds, they were securing eternal rule. In practice, they were breeding themselves into oblivion. When Charles II gasped his last in Madrid, the Habsburg experiment had run its course in Spain. Austria carried on, producing emperors, archdukes, and Franz Joseph, with his famous whiskers. But the shadow of the jaw never entirely disappeared. Even today, when people mention the Habsburgs, it is not their empire, their reforms, or their cultural patronage that springs first to mind. It is that distinctive, protruding chin, a monument in bone to the hazards of dynastic obsession. And so, while peasants across Europe continued to dine on gritty bread and watery pottage, the great Habsburg emperors sat at golden tables, gnawing, painfully, with jaws that could barely align. Proof, perhaps, that being royal spared you from hunger, but not from the quiet cruelty of your own genealogy. The awkward afterlife of Henry VIII's children. The Habsburgs may have collapsed under the weight of their own jaws, but across the Channel, England was busy producing a royal family whose lives resembled a series of cautionary tales. Henry, Fate left behind more than a trail of discarded wives. He left 3 children, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward, each destined to inherit a throne that felt less like an honor and more like a trap. Henry's obsession with producing a male heir shaped his entire reign. 6 marriages, 2 annulments, and a few executions later, he finally got his son, Edward. Poor Edward. He was born in 1537 to Jane Seymour, Henry's 3rd wife and the only one who managed the rare feat of both giving him a boy and dying conveniently in childbirth, thus avoiding Henry's eventual disappointment. Edward was a delicate child from the start. Frail, pale, prone to illness, he was the Tudor dynasty's great hope, packaged in a body that seemed allergic to survival. Nevertheless, Henry doted on him. Here at last was the son to carry on the Tudor name. The kingdom could relax, except, of course, it couldn't. Edward was only 9 when his father died in 1547, and England discovered the joy of being ruled by a child. Edward VI's reign was technically his, but practically in the hands of regents. First his uncle, Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, then later John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland. The boy king was bright and precocious, keen on Protestant reforms, but physically he was in no condition to steer a nation. He suffered from chronic coughing, fevers, and weakness. By his teens, it was obvious he was declining. In 1553, Edward died at the age of 15, probably of tuberculosis, though some suggested a chest infection compounded by measles. His body wasted away while his council scrambled to manipulate succession. Northumberland tried to place Lady Jane Grey, Edward's Protestant cousin, on the throne. She lasted 9 days before being unceremoniously replaced by Mary Tudor, Henry's eldest daughter. Jane was executed shortly afterward, remembered forever as the 9 Days Queen, which is a bit like being remembered as the person who once almost caught the bus. Mary had endured a grim childhood. She was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife, and had been declared illegitimate when Henry divorced her mother. She had watched her father parade new wives through the palace, while her own position shifted precariously. By the time she finally became queen in 1553, she was 40, embittered, and determined to restore Catholicism to England. Mary's reign was marked by what might politely be called enthusiastic religious policy. She married Philip II of Spain, yes, another Habsburg jaw, hoping to produce a Catholic heir. The marriage was unpopular in England, where people resented the idea of Spanish influence. Philip himself was not particularly fond of his new wife, spending little time with her. Mary's greatest personal tragedy was her desperate attempt to conceive. She experienced at least 2 phantom pregnancies, complete with swelling belly, morning sickness, and court celebrations. No child ever came. Whether these were pseudocyesis or perhaps misdiagnosed tumors, the effect was devastating. She longed for the security of an heir, and her body betrayed her. Her legacy earned her the grim nickname Bloody Mary, thanks to her persecution of Protestants. Nearly 300 people were burned at the stake during her short reign. The spectacle was meant to terrify dissent into silence. Instead, it produced martyrs, hardening Protestant resolve. Mary died childless in 1558 at the age of 42, likely from uterine or ovarian cancer. Her stomach, distended again in her final months, gave her the cruel illusion of yet another pregnancy. She left behind a kingdom still uncertain, and the throne passed to her half-sister Elizabeth. Elizabeth I's reign is often remembered as a golden age: Shakespeare, sea voyages, the Armada. And to be fair, compared to her siblings, she was remarkably effective. But her personal life was far from golden. Elizabeth had survived her father's court by mastering caution. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, had been executed when Elizabeth was just 2 years old. Declared illegitimate, restored, pushed aside, restored again. Elizabeth learned to watch her words and her step. When she finally became queen at 25, she carried the scars of constant danger. She never married. Officially, she declared herself wedded to her kingdom, cultivating the image of the Virgin Queen. Practically, marriage was a trap. If she wed a foreign prince, she risked turning England into a satellite of Spain or France. If she married an English noble, factional jealousy would tear the court apart. Remaining single was both political, calculation, and personal armor. Her court was full of suitors and rumors. Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, was the closest to her heart, but his wife's suspicious death in 1560 made marriage politically impossible. Foreign princes sent proposals, archdukes, kings, the Duke of Anjou, but Elizabeth danced diplomatically around them, using her unmarried status as a bargaining chip. She dangled possibilities without ever committing. Her reign was not without trouble. The Catholic threat loomed constantly, particularly from Mary, Queen of Scots, her cousin. Mary had a stronger hereditary claim in the eyes of Catholics, and after being deposed in Scotland, she fled to England. Elizabeth kept her under house arrest for nearly 2 decades before finally consenting to her execution in 1587. It was a decision that haunted her, but also one that secured her throne. The Spanish Armada in 1588 provided Elizabeth with her greatest moment of theatrical triumph. Dressed in armor, she addressed her troops at Tilbury, declaring she had the heart and stomach of a king. The Armada's defeat by English naval tactics and, more importantly, bad weather, solidified her legend. But it also fed the myth of divine favor, a useful aura for a queen who had no husband or children. Privately, Elizabeth aged poorly. Smallpox in 1562 left her with scars, which she covered with heavy layers of white lead makeup. Over time, this makeup damaged her skin, further creating a vicious cycle. Courtiers spoke cautiously about her vanity, while painters carefully flattered her in portraits. By her 60s, she was toothless, ill, and increasingly paranoid. She relied on younger courtiers, suspicious of plots, and refused to name a successor. Until her death in 1603, she died childless, the last of the Tudors. With no direct heirs, the crown passed to James VI of Scotland, son of Mary, Queen of Scots. Thus, the Tudors ended not with a glorious heir, but with a careful handover to the rival branch they had spent decades trying to suppress. Henry VIII's dynastic obsession had produced 3 heirs, none of whom left children. Edward died young, Mary died childless, Elizabeth remained unmarried. The Tudor line, which Henry had torn England apart to secure, fizzled out in a single generation. It is one of history's great ironies. Henry broke with Rome, executed wives, dissolved monasteries, and drenched his kingdom in blood, all for the sake of ensuring heirs. And yet, his family tree withered almost as soon as he was gone. His children carried the weight of his ambition, and each in their own way, failed to continue it. The Tudors live on in legend, magnificent, tragic, theatrical, but in reality, they left nothing behind but debt, instability, and a vacancy on the throne conveniently filled by a Scottish cousin. Ivan the Terrible's meltdowns and midnight rages. The Tudors had burned themselves out on succession crises and phantom pregnancies, but further east, Russia was producing a ruler whose personal habits made even Henry VIII look like a calming presence. Ivan IV of Moscow, better remembered as Ivan the Terrible, was less a steady monarch and more a collection of outbursts stitched together into a reign. Ivan was born in 1530, the long-awaited son of Vasily III. His early life was a cocktail of instability and trauma. His father died when Ivan was just 3, leaving him technically the Grand Prince of Moscow. A regency council was set up, which predictably descended into factional bickering. His mother, Elena Glinskaya, tried to hold things together, but she died suddenly when Ivan was 8. Poison was suspected, because in 16th century Russian politics, poison was the unofficial national sport. That left young Ivan in the care of boyar nobles who treated him less like a ruler and more like a pawn. He grew up in the Kremlin surrounded by neglect, humiliation, and violence. Accounts describe him and his younger brother left hungry, shabbily clothed, and taunted by the aristocrats who were supposed to serve him. The resentment hardened early. By his teens, Ivan was already dreaming of revenge. When he came of age, he wasted no time asserting himself. In 1547, at just 16, he was crowned Tsar of all the Russias, the first ruler to take the title. The ceremony, heavy with Byzantine symbolism, set the tone for his reign. He wanted to be more than a regional prince. He wanted divine authority. He married Anastasia Romanovna from a relatively minor noble family, and by most accounts, she softened him for a while. Those early years, known as his good period, saw legal reforms, church councils, and military campaigns that expanded Russia's reach. But moderation was not Ivan's natural state. When Anastasia died suddenly in 1560, possibly from illness, possibly from poison, Ivan's fragile balance shattered. He was convinced the boyars had murdered her. His grief curdled into paranoia. From then on, his reign was less about building a state and more about punishing anyone who might remotely threaten him. The most infamous expression of this was the oprichnina, launched in 1565. Ivan divided the country in two. One half, the zemshchina, under traditional administration. The other half, the oprichnina, under his direct control. He staffed this second half with his personal militia, the oprichniki. They wore black, rode black horses, and carried dog heads and brooms on their saddles, symbols of sniffing out treason and sweeping it away. It was less law enforcement and more traveling death squad. The oprichniki terrorized towns, seized estates, and executed suspected traitors in inventive ways. Entire regions were devastated. In Novgorod, accused of plotting with Lithuania, Ivan's forces unleashed weeks of mass killings in 1570. Men, women, children, drowned in icy rivers, tortured, slaughtered. Ivan himself is said to have taken part, riding through the city while the oprichniki did their work. This was not a one-off tantrum. It was a lifestyle. Ivan had meltdowns the way other rulers had banquets. His personal rages were legendary. He would strike courtiers in fits of anger. He screamed, wept, and accused his advisors of betrayal on a rotating basis. At times, he fled. Moscow altogether, retreating into monasteries in dramatic gestures of abdication, only to return when begged by clergy and nobles. He enjoyed the theater of power almost as much as its reality. One of the darkest moments came in 1581. During a quarrel with his son and heir, also named Ivan, the Tsar struck him on the head with his staff. The younger Ivan collapsed and died. The event shocked contemporaries and even appears in one of the most famous Russian paintings, Ilya Repin's Ivan the Terrible and His Son, which shows the Tsar cradling the dying boy in horror, blood streaming from the wound. Whether Ivan intended the blow to be fatal is uncertain. What is certain is that he killed his most competent heir in a fit of temper. That left the succession in the hands of his second son, Fyodor, who was frail, childless, and politically passive. Ivan, in short, managed to dynastically sabotage himself in one swing. His public meltdowns were not limited to violence. He was also prone to bizarre rituals. He forced nobles to join him in elaborate religious ceremonies, then humiliated them with sudden accusations. He staged grotesque entertainments, mock trials, sadistic banquets, unpredictable punishments. Servants lived in fear of a glance or a word setting him off. Yet Ivan was not without moments of intelligence and cunning. He corresponded with Elizabeth, Eye of England, exploring the idea of trade alliances and even a personal asylum should his own nobles rise against him. His letters were rambling, paranoid, but also sharp, full of demands for loyalty and assurances of his own divine authority. Elizabeth, politely baffled, maintained the correspondence without committing to much. Militarily, Ivan's reign was expansionist, but uneven. He conquered Kazan and Astrakhan, extending Russia eastward into the Volga basin and opening routes toward Siberia. These victories were celebrated as holy wars against Muslim Khanates, cementing his image as a Christian warrior. But in the West, against Poland and Sweden, he fared poorly. The drawn-out Livonian War drained resources, ended in failure, and left Russia weakened. By the later years, Ivan's paranoia was matched only by his ill health. He suffered from gout, chronic pain, and bouts of depression. He obsessed over astrology, omens, and relics. He surrounded himself with priests and soothsayers, trying to ward off the fate he feared. Yet he continued to lash out at nobles, clergy, even commoners unlucky enough to cross his path. In March 1584, he died suddenly while playing chess, collapsing mid-game. The cause was likely a stroke, though rumors of poisoning persisted. For a man who saw treachery everywhere, it was almost fitting that his death was clouded in suspicion. Ivan the Terrible's reign left Russia stronger in territory but shattered in morale. The Oprichnina had devastated the economy, depopulated regions, and entrenched a culture of fear. His personal rages destroyed his own family line, leaving the succession weak and leading eventually into the time of troubles, a period of famine, civil war, and impostors claiming the throne. He remains both feared and celebrated in Russian memory. To some, he was a tyrant who bathed the land in blood. To others, a necessary founder of the Russian state, the man who set the tone for autocracy. Either way, he lived up to his epithet. Terrible not in the modern sense of bad, but in the older sense of awe-inspiring, fearsome, catastrophic. And so, while the Tudors fizzled into extinction with quiet childlessness, Ivan roared his dynasty into chaos with midnight rages, fire, and the fatal swing of his staff. Two different dynasties, two different forms of disaster, one hushed, the other deafening. Louis XIV, the Sun King who couldn't stop spending. Russia had its Tsar who thought himself divine by rage, but France produced a king who thought himself divine by design. Louis XIV, the Sun King, spent more than 70 years on the throne, and during that time, he perfected the art of being admired, obeyed, and financially ruinous. He was born in 1638 after more than 2 decades of his parents' childless marriage. The French court saw his birth as miraculous, and he was christened Dieu donné, God-given. From the beginning, his life was steeped in theatrical symbolism. When he was 5, his father Louis X died, leaving him king under the regency of his formidable mother, Anne of Austria. Real governing fell to Cardinal Mazarin, who trained the boy king in both politics and the art of manipulation. The regency years scarred Louis. Civil wars known as the Fronde erupted, led by nobles and parlements resisting royal centralization. At one point, rioters forced their way into the royal palace, and the young king supposedly had to feign sleep while they stared at him. The lesson he carried for the rest of his life: never trust the nobility, never allow them proximity without control, and never be caught looking weak. When Mazarin died in 1661, Louis was 22. Instead of appointing a new first minister, he simply announced that he would govern alone. It wasn't so much a bold innovation as a long act of theater. Louis wanted every gesture of his reign to radiate authority. He staged himself as the sun around which France revolved, adopting Apollo imagery, commissioning art and architecture that cast him as semi-divine. The Palace of Versailles became his grandest stage. Originally a modest hunting lodge, Louis transformed it into the ultimate royal showcase. Endless galleries, manicured gardens, gilded chambers. It was less a palace and more an argument carved into stone that Louis was the axis of the universe. Of course, Versailles was also a cunning political trap. By forcing nobles to live there, competing for petty honors, like the privilege of holding the king's nightshirt while he undressed, Louis reduced them from independent feudal lords into elaborate courtiers. The daily rituals of his lever, getting up, and coucher, going to bed, turned intimacy with the king into a prize. Nobles schemed for the honor of handing him a handkerchief, as though that were the pinnacle of human achievement. All of this, naturally, cost staggering sums of money. Versailles devoured revenue, armies consumed even more. Louis fought a near-unbroken series of wars: the War of Devolution, the Dutch War, the 9 Years' War, the War of the Spanish Succession. France's borders expanded and contracted like an overworked accordion. Victories were grandly celebrated, defeats were politely ignored, but the treasury bled either way. Finance ministers like Colbert tried to stabilize things with mercantilist reforms, encouraging industry, expanding overseas colonies, and regulating trade. Colbert was competent, but Louis's spending habits were insatiable. Wars, palaces, pensions for courtiers, mistresses with expensive tastes. It was like trying to balance a budget for someone who believes money is a divine river that never runs dry. Speaking of mistresses, Louis kept a roster. His official wife, Maria Theresa of Spain, dutifully produced children but never captured his affection. Instead, women like Louise de la Vallière, Madame de Montespan, and Madame de Maintenon dominated the court at different times. Montespan, witty and ambitious, held sway for years, even as rumors of black masses and love potions swirled around her. Louis acknowledged numerous illegitimate children, elevating many into positions of influence. For a king who styled himself the model of Catholic virtue, his personal life was a tapestry of contradiction. Late in life, after Montespan's fall, he married Madame de Maintenon in a secret ceremony. She was pious, serious, and exerted a moderating influence, though she could not undo decades of excess. Religion was another realm where Louis indulged his need for control. In 1685, he revoked the Edict of Nantes, which had granted limited toleration to Protestants. Overnight, Huguenots lost their legal protections. Churches were destroyed, ministers exiled, families harassed into conversion. Hundreds of thousands fled France, carrying skills and capital to more tolerant neighbors like England and the Dutch Republic. It was a pious gesture that weakened France's economy and strengthened its rivals, an irony lost on Louis, who saw himself as God's most loyal lieutenant. His vanity extended to his body. Louis was meticulous about appearances, though his actual health was a battlefield. He endured smallpox in youth, survived a series of painful ailments, and spent his later years in near-constant discomfort. An especially unpleasant episode involved a fistula near his anus, which required a painful surgical operation in 1686. The success of the surgery was celebrated across France as a national victory, with commemorative medals struck in honor of his healed backside. Court life continued even in illness. Servants dressed him, surgeons treated him, courtiers hovered, all while he insisted on the grandeur of ritual. By his 70s, his body was failing, but his insistence on ceremony never faltered. He was still the sun, even if orbiting him required. Ignoring the smell of infected wounds, Louis outlived nearly all of his legitimate heirs. His son, the Grand Dauphin, died in 1711. The Dauphin's son, the Duke of Burgundy, died in 1712, as did Burgundy's wife and eldest son in quick succession, victims of measles. By the time Louis himself finally died in 1715, aged 76, the crown passed to his 5-year-old great-grandson, the future Louis XV. After 7 decades of centralized authority, France was once again handed to a child. The Sun King's legacy was dazzling but brittle. Versailles remained a monument to royal splendor, but the kingdom was drowning in debt. His wars had strained France's resources, his religious policies had weakened its social fabric, and his rigid insistence on absolute monarchy left little room for adaptation. For contemporaries, he was glorious. For posterity, he was a gilded, warning about the costs of vanity. And so, just as peasants in his realm still gnawed on coarse bread and soldiers froze in mud-filled trenches, Louis spent decades ensuring that his courtiers competed for the privilege of holding a candlestick. He believed himself the sun, radiant and eternal, and in some ways he succeeded. But he also left behind the long shadow of bankruptcy, discontent, and a monarchy so inflexible that when crisis came later, it shattered. The sad misfires of Spain's Bourbon kings. Louis XIV had done more than exhaust France. He had also exported his dynasty. Through the War of the Spanish Succession, his grandson Philippe of Anjou became Philip V of Spain. It was a dynastic win for the Bourbons, though it came at the cost of endless battles and Europe reshuffling itself once again. Still, France could now look south with pride. The family brand had gone international. Philip V was crowned in 1700. Spain, at the time, was, let's say, not thriving. The once great empire had collapsed under the weight of bad management, expensive wars, and rulers of questionable competence. By the time Philip arrived, the machinery of empire was wheezing like an old mule. Philip himself was shy, anxious, and perpetually melancholy. He was devoted to his wife, Maria Louisa of Savoy, but so indecisive in government that ministers often despaired. He could not sit still during meetings, pacing, mumbling, and at times bursting into tears. Court observers noted that he was naturally incapable of ruling, which is rarely the endorsement one hopes for in a monarch. The War of the Spanish Succession did not help. Philip's claim was opposed by Austria, England, and the Dutch Republic, all of whom preferred a Habsburg candidate. Fighting dragged across Europe for more than a decade. Spain itself became a battlefield, with Catalonia and Valencia resisting Bourbon centralization. The Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 eventually confirmed Philip as king, but at a steep cost. Spain lost territories in Italy and the Netherlands, and Britain walked away with Gibraltar and Minorca. Philip, however, remained firmly Bourbon. He imported French advisors, French customs, and French fashions, which endeared him to some and alienated many others. At times, he spoke more French than Spanish, a charming trait in the King of Spain. His bouts of depression worsened after Maria Luisa's death in 1714, leaving him withdrawn and prone to erratic decisions. Enter Elizabeth Farnese, his second wife. She was ambitious, energetic, and more than capable of running things when Philip collapsed into melancholy. In fact, she often did. Ministers learned quickly that to get anything done, one had to go through her. She focused obsessively on securing Italian thrones for her children, plunging Spain into new wars to reclaim bits of the old empire. Meanwhile, Philip oscillated between apathy and frantic religiosity. He attended Mass constantly, confessed compulsively, and sometimes refused to change clothes for weeks at a time. In the mornings, he might be found half-dressed, mumbling prayers, refusing to leave his chamber. On darker days, he ranted that he was damned, or that he was already dead. At one point, he refused to cut his hair or nails, convinced that grooming was a sin. Elizabeth handled these episodes with brisk determination. If Philip would not act, she acted for him. Spain, under her influence, regained some vigor, even if it was mostly spent chasing dynastic scraps in Italy. Philip abdicated in 1724, handing the throne to his son Louis. The experiment lasted 7 months. Young Louis apparent. I died suddenly of smallpox, and Philip, reluctantly, returned to the throne. It was not a triumphant comeback. His health continued to falter, his mind deteriorated, and by the 1730s he was barely functional. He finally died in 1746, leaving behind a kingdom both stabilized and exhausted. The next Bourbon, Ferdinand VI, was a quieter figure. Known as the Just, he tried to stay out of foreign wars and repair the treasury. He and his Portuguese-born wife, Barbara of Braganza, lived in relative seclusion, preferring music to politics. Barbara imported Italian composers and turned the court into a miniature opera house. Ferdinand, shy and melancholy like his father, went along. But Barbara died in 1758, and Ferdinand unraveled. He fell into depression, withdrew from affairs, and refused food. Convinced he was doomed, he wasted away and died within a year, leaving no heirs. It was another dynastic shuffle. This time, the crown passed to his half-brother Charles, already king of Naples and Sicily. Charles III was, by Bourbon standards, competent. He brought administrative reforms, modernized the army, and attempted to revive Spain's economy. He built roads, drained marshes, and encouraged science and industry. His ministers were often Enlightenment-minded, pushing policies that nudged Spain, however reluctantly, into the 18th century. He also expelled the Jesuits in 1767, blaming them for unrest and conspiracies. The move shocked much of Catholic Europe, but Charles was nothing if not decisive. Unlike his father and brother, he actually liked ruling. He hunted obsessively, dressed simply, and spent much of his time outdoors, which endeared him to some as a refreshingly unpretentious monarch. Yet even Charles could not solve Spain's deeper malaise. Colonial revenues were shrinking, British naval power was ascendant, and the Bourbon reforms often stirred resistance rather than loyalty. When Charles died in 1788, he left the throne to his son, Charles IV, who promptly demonstrated that the family knack for mismanagement was alive and well. Charles IV was amiable but utterly dominated by his wife, Maria Luisa of Parma, and by their favorite, Manuel Godoy. Godoy, a young guardsman elevated rapidly through Maria Luisa's favor, became prime minister, duke, prince, and general-in-chief, despite a lack of qualifications beyond charm and pliability. The court buzzed with rumors that he was more than a political favorite, though Maria Luisa denied it with regal irritation. Under Godoy's guidance, Spain drifted into a disastrous alliance with revolutionary France, then with Napoleonic France, then against France, depending on who was invading at the moment. The navy was crushed at Trafalgar in 1805, the economy faltered, and the monarchy's reputation crumbled. Charles IV, meanwhile, painted by Goya, looked bewildered, soft-faced, almost apologetic. His family portraits resemble a middle-class group accidentally dressed in royal costumes, each face a little too ordinary for the grandeur intended. Goya's brush captured what courtiers muttered, that Spain had slipped from stern Habsburg majesty into a kind of provincial muddle. By 1808, Napoleon had tired of the charade. He summoned Charles IV and his son Ferdinand to Bayonne, pressured them into abdication, and installed his brother Joseph Bonaparte on the Spanish throne. The Bourbon dynasty, exported so triumphantly by Louis XIV, found itself shoved aside by a Corsican opportunist. Spain erupted in revolt, and the Peninsular War began, a brutal, grinding conflict that bled the country for years. Eventually, the Bourbons returned, of course, but the aura was gone. They limped into the 19th century, with reputations tarnished, dynasties fractured, and a sense that their golden age had passed centuries earlier. What remained were memories of indecisive kings, domineering queens, ambitious ministers, and a string of misfires that left Spain diminished. It was almost poetic. The Sun King had exported his dynasty as though it were a luxury good, gilded and perfect. Yet in Spain, the product line quickly showed its flaws. Melancholy kings who wouldn't get dressed, operatic courts that dissolved into grief, favorites who governed while monarchs mumbled. A dynasty not so much glorious as faintly absurd. The Hanoverians, a dynasty of miserable marriages. While Spain fumbled with depressed kings and domineering queens, Britain imported a new dynasty of its own. The Stuart line had sputtered out in 1714, leaving the throne awkwardly vacant. Parliament, not eager to see a Catholic claimant restore old chaos, looked abroad for a Protestant option. They settled on the Elector of Hanover, a small German state that produced precisely the sort of dependable mediocrity they could tolerate. Thus began the Hanoverian dynasty, a family that managed Britain through the 18th and 19th centuries while despising one another with remarkable consistency. Their public image was stability. Their private lives were closer to tragic farce. The first Hanoverian king, George I, did not exactly sparkle. Born in 1660, he grew up in Hanover, spoke mostly German, and reached the throne of Britain by virtue of being the closest Protestant relative. His connection to the English crown was so tenuous that contemporary satirists drew family trees as though they were badly copied maps. George's personal life was anything but regal. He married Sophia Dorothea of Celle, a union arranged for dynastic advantage rather than romance. The marriage collapsed spectacularly. Sophia Dorothea fell in love with a Swedish count, Philip von Königsmarck. The affair was discovered. Königsmarck conveniently disappeared, almost certainly murdered, and Sophia Dorothea was locked away in a castle at Ahlden for the rest of her life. She spent 30 years imprisoned, while George carried on with mistresses quite openly. By the time he became King of Britain, George I had the charm of a distracted accountant and the charisma of cold porridge. He spoke little English, relied heavily on ministers, and preferred Hanover to London. His reign established cabinet government by accident. Since he wasn't keen on attending meetings, ministers began handling affairs themselves. From neglect came innovation. George II inherited in 1727 and was not much warmer. He did at least speak English, though with a heavy accent. He was irritable, quick-tempered, and fond of military display. His queen, Caroline of Ansbach, was far shrewder and managed to guide policy through tact and patience, balancing her husband's rages with calm persuasion. Their marriage was oddly functional. George was unfaithful, keeping mistresses as expected, but he remained emotionally dependent on Caroline. When she died in 1737, he was devastated. Accounts say he visited her body repeatedly and promised to be buried beside her, not in the usual grand fashion, but with his coffin side by side, lids removed so their remains might mingle. For a dynasty of cold unions, it was a rare flicker of affection. George II's court was otherwise dominated by quarrels with his son, Frederick, Prince of Wales. The Hanoverian pattern of fathers despising sons became a near law of nature. Frederick criticized his father's ministers, staged his own rival court, and generally did everything possible to irritate George. When Frederick died before his father, the king reportedly remarked that it was one less enemy. George III, ascending in 1760, promised a break in the cycle. He was British-born, spoke English as his first language, and presented himself as a devoted family man. He married Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, and together they produced 15 children, an achievement as much logistical as biological. Unlike his Hanoverian forebears, George III avoided mistresses and genuinely cared for his queen, but domestic virtue could not shield him from political disaster. His reign saw the loss of the American colonies, a humiliation he never forgot. "We have lost the brightest jewel in the crown," he lamented, though he tried to console himself with the remaining empire. His mental health, however, became the defining feature of his later years. Beginning in the 1780s, he suffered recurrent bouts of illness, likely a form of bipolar disorder or porphyria. He would babble incoherently, talk for hours without pause, and become violently agitated. During episodes, he foamed at the mouth, spoke to imaginary people, and once embraced a tree convinced it was the King of Prussia. The court tried to manage the spectacle with discretion, but rumors spread. Cartoons depicted the king in straitjackets. Parliament debated regency bills. His son, the future George III, hovered eagerly, waiting for power. Doctors bled him, blistered him, dosed him with purgatives, treatments as likely to worsen as to cure. By 1810, after a final severe breakdown, George III was declared permanently insane. He lived the last decade of his life secluded at Windsor, blind, deaf, and wandering in delusions. When he died in 1820, the image of the kindly family man had been eclipsed by the memory of the Mad King. His son George IV was the opposite in every way. Where George III was dutiful, George IV was indulgent. He lived extravagantly, building the Brighton Pavilion with its Indo-Islamic domes and interiors stuffed with gilt, silk, and chinoiserie. He spent recklessly, collected mistresses, and left debts the government had to quietly absorb. His marriage to Caroline of Brunswick was an unmitigated disaster. They met for the first time on their wedding day in 1795, and George supposedly demanded brandy to steady his nerves. Caroline was loud, careless with hygiene, and uninterested in hiding her own affairs. George despised her almost instantly. They separated within a year after producing one daughter, Princess Charlotte. The estrangement turned into a national scandal. When George became king in 1820, he attempted to divorce Caroline through Parliament, accusing her of adultery. The trial captivated the public, who largely sympathized with Caroline as the underdog. Riots broke out in her favor. George, bloated and ridiculed, came across as vindictive. Caroline died the next year, barred from attending George's coronation. George IV's health declined rapidly under the weight of obesity, gout, and years of drinking. By his death in 1830, he was remembered less for governing than for gluttony and architectural projects. One obituary described him as the first gentleman of Europe, with a straight face few believed. His brother William IV followed, known as the Sailor King for his naval career. By Hanoverian standards, he was refreshingly simple. He lived openly with his mistress, Dorothea Jordan, for 20 years, fathering 10 illegitimate children. Only after her did he reluctantly marry Princess Adelaide of Saxe-Meiningen, a quiet and dutiful wife who tolerated his eccentricities. William disliked pomp and tried to cut costs, dismissing court chefs and parades. He walked through London, without guards, chatting with passers-by. Parliament, however, demanded reforms, and under his reign, the 1832 Reform Act expanded the electorate and reduced rotten boroughs. William grumbled, but ultimately gave in, knowing resistance would backfire. He died childless in 1837, leaving the throne to his niece Victoria. With her, the Hanoverians in Britain effectively ended, though they continued in Germany. The dynasty's record was less about glorious victories and more about familial misery. George I locked up his wife for life. George II quarreled with his son until the grave. George III descended into madness. George IV loathed his wife and bankrupted himself. William IV lived in semi-domestic chaos with his mistress and illegitimate brood. Yet somehow, through all this, the Hanoverians presided over Britain's rise as a global power. Wars were fought, colonies expanded, industry roared, and Parliament grew stronger. The family dramas played out like a soap opera behind the scaffolding of empire. It was perhaps fitting. Britain didn't need brilliant kings. It needed stability, or at least predictability. The Hanoverians delivered that, if only by stumbling from one miserable marriage to the next. Marie Antoinette and the Art of Being Hated. While Britain's Hanoverians were busy despising one another across palaces and parliaments, France's Bourbon produced a figure who became hated on such a scale that her name still conjures rolling eyes and guillotines. Marie Antoinette, Austrian Archduchess, French Queen, and professional scapegoat, was less a villain than a lightning rod for every grievance of the 18th century. She was born in 1755, the 15th child of Empress Maria Theresa of Austria. By the time she was 15, she was bundled off to France to cement an alliance with the Bourbons. Her new husband, the Dauphin Louis, was a plump, shy 17-year-old with a fondness for locks, keys, and hunting. The marriage was symbolic rather than romantic. Austria and France were now allies, and two awkward teenagers were expected to embody the new harmony. Unfortunately, Louis and Marie Antoinette were spectacularly ill-suited. He was withdrawn and indecisive. She was lively, sociable, and easily bored. He preferred the company of blacksmiths tinkering with ironwork. She preferred dances, theaters, and elaborate gowns. They also failed to consummate their marriage for the first 7 years, thanks to a mixture of Louis's medical issues, possibly phimosis, corrected by minor surgery, and sheer mutual awkwardness. The French court was merciless in gossip. The young Dauphine's inability to produce an heir became a subject of endless whispers. Libels spread depicting her as frigid, unfaithful, or both. In reality, she was simply stuck with a husband who couldn't or wouldn't perform, while courtiers sharpened their knives against her foreignness. When Louis XVI finally ascended the throne in 1774, at just 20, the pressure intensified. He and Marie Antoinette were crowned king and queen, but their reputations diverged quickly. Louis, earnest but indecisive, threw himself into hunting and lockmaking. Marie Antoinette, still childless, leaned harder into the pleasures of Versailles. Her spending became infamous, though much of it was exaggerated. She enjoyed gambling, lavish dresses, and elaborate hairstyles, sometimes sculpted into ship-shaped towers several feet high. She built the Petit Trianon, a small palace on the grounds of Versailles, where she staged pastoral fantasies, dressing as a shepherdess while servants managed the livestock. To peasants facing rising bread prices, this looked less like innocent play and more like mockery. Children eventually arrived, 4 in total, but rumors of infidelity never stopped. Libelous pamphlets, known as libelles, accused her of affairs with everyone from Swedish counts to female courtiers. One especially damaging scandal came in 1785, the affair of the diamond necklace. The scheme involved swindlers tricking a cardinal into believing he was helping the queen secretly purchase an extravagant diamond necklace to win back the king's affection. When the fraud was exposed, Marie Antoinette had nothing to do with it. But in the public imagination, she became Madame Deficit, the frivolous queen bankrupting the nation with jewels. The truth mattered little, symbolism mattered everything. By the late 1780s, France was drowning in debt from decades of wars, poor harvests, and a tax system rigged to protect the nobility. Bread riots spread, pamphlets raged against the court. Marie Antoinette, foreign and glamorous, became the perfect target. She never actually said, "Let them eat cake." The phrase had floated around long before, attributed to other royals. But once attached to her name, it stuck. The story was too perfect. A queen so detached from suffering, she thought brioche was a solution to famine. Whether she ever heard the rumor or not, she was branded with it forever. Louis XVI, meanwhile, floundered. He called the Estates General in 1789, a move meant to address fiscal crisis, but which unleashed revolutionary forces he could not control. The Bastille fell. Crowds marched on Versailles, dragging the royal family to Paris. Marie Antoinette, once adored for her beauty, now faced mobs shouting for her head. Her composure under pressure, however, impressed even critics. During the October March on Versailles, she appeared on a balcony before a furious crowd, bowing silently. The gesture, defiant yet dignified, momentarily quieted the mob, but symbolism could not save her forever. As revolution deepened, escape attempts worsened their plight. In 1791, the royal family tried to flee Paris in the so-called Flight to Varennes. They were caught, dragged back, and humiliated. Trust evaporated. To revolutionaries, they were no longer misguided rulers. They were traitors conspiring with foreign enemies. Louis was executed in January 1793. 9 months later, Marie Antoinette faced the guillotine. Her trial was a foregone conclusion, padded with lurid accusations, including one grotesque claim that she had committed incest with her young son. She denied it with visible disgust, winning sympathy even from hostile onlookers. But sympathy did not alter the verdict. On October 16th, she was taken to the scaffold in a plain white gown, her hair shorn. She accidentally stepped on her executioner's foot and apologized. Her last recorded words. The blade fell, and the crowd cheered. Marie Antoinette's legacy is tangled. She was frivolous, yes, but no more than most queens of her era. She spent heavily, but not nearly as heavily as the French army or the king's own projects. Her greatest crime was being visible at the wrong time, foreign, glamorous, and easy to caricature. The revolution needed villains, and she was made to order. Her story lingers not because she was particularly monstrous, but because she became the perfect symbol of monarchy's disconnect from reality. A shepherdess queen playing at simplicity while peasants starved. A diamond necklace she never touched, but which ruined her image. A phrase she never uttered, but which still clings to her name centuries later. In the end, Marie Antoinette was less a villain than a mirror. The anger of a nation reflected onto her gowns, her hairstyles, her accent. And when the blade fell, it was less about her than about the crumbling of a whole order she happened to embody. The Habsburg jaw and other family handicaps. If Marie Antoinette showed how a dynasty could collapse under the weight of public hatred, the Habsburgs showed how a dynasty could collapse under the weight of its own DNA. For centuries, the family strategy was simple. Keep power in the family by marrying cousins, nieces, and sometimes uncomfortably closer relations. The results were visible. The Habsburg jaw, a protruding lower lip and jutting chin, became their trademark. It appeared gradually in portraits from the 16th century onward, turning regal faces into a gallery of increasingly lopsided profiles. The jaw was not the only issue. Generations of intermarriage produced fragile health, infertility, and a collection of monarchs whose personal habits ranged from eccentric to outright tragic. Take Charles II of Spain, known simply as El Hechizado, the Bewitched. Born in 1661, he was the product of repeated Habsburg cousin marriages. His pedigree was less a family tree than a family wreath. Both his parents were descendants of Philip I and Joanna of Castile, making Charles's genetic inheritance alarmingly narrow. The consequences were immediate. Charles was sickly, weak, and developmentally delayed. He didn't walk until age 8, didn't speak until nearly 4, and his jaw protruded so severely that chewing was a challenge. His tongue was so large that speaking clearly was nearly impossible. He was short, thin, and constantly ill, afflicted with fevers, stomach troubles, and seizures. And yet, he was king. Charles's reign from 1665 to 1700 was a slow-motion dynastic tragedy. He married twice, first to Marie-Louise of Orléans, then to Maria Anna of Neuburg, but produced no children. Courtiers whispered about curses, witchcraft, and divine punishment. Physicians subjected him to endless treatments from bleeding, and purges to exotic potions. Priests performed exorcisms. None of it made him fertile, or healthy, or capable of ruling effectively. Politically, Spain during his reign was a husk of its former self. The empire was shrinking, the treasury was empty, and rival powers circled like vultures. Charles himself was more symbol than sovereign, shuffling through rituals while ministers squabbled. His eventual death in 1700, childless and broken, triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, the grand European brawl that handed Spain to the Bourbons and finally ended Habsburg rule there. Charles II was perhaps the clearest case of what centuries of inbreeding could do to a dynasty, leave behind a monarch who embodied decline in his very body. But the Habsburgs weren't just unfortunate in Spain. The Austrian branch fared better politically, but their family quirks were equally noticeable. Consider Emperor Ferdinand I, whose jaw was so pronounced that he could barely close his mouth. Or his descendant Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor in the late 17th century, whose portraits reveal a chin so exaggerated it looks like he's perpetually chewing something unpleasant. Leopold was intelligent, pious, and dedicated to his empire, but his appearance became symbolic of the dynasty's genetic bottleneck. Courtiers joked discreetly about his profile, though few dared say much openly. This was, after all, a family that thought nothing of arranging a niece's marriage to her uncle if it secured a boarder. By the 18th century, the Austrian Habsburgs tried to correct course. Maria Theresa, ruler of Austria and mother of 16, married her children into a variety of dynasties, attempting to dilute the gene pool. This was the strategy that sent Marie Antoinette to France and Leopold to Tuscany. It helped, but not before centuries of damage had been done. The medical consequences were only one side of the story. The other was psychological. A dynasty obsessed with keeping power in the family produced rulers who saw Europe less as a map of nations and more as a marriage chart. Diplomacy was genealogy. Wars were fought to enforce wedding contracts. Entire populations were shuffled because two cousins had signed a betrothal treaty at age 6. Even in portraits, the decline is visible. Compare early Habsburgs like Charles V, with his heavy chin but still commanding presence, to later ones, like Charles II of Spain, whose face looks like a caricature of the earlier generation. Painters tried to flatter, but the jaw always emerged, stubborn as the family's habit of marrying itself. It's easy to make jokes about the jaw, and many contemporaries did. Satirists mocked the royal profile, poets hinted at deformity, and pamphleteers compared Charles II to grotesque creatures. Yet behind the humor lay something darker. A dynasty that had gambled everything on purity of blood and wound up fragile, infertile, and incapable of sustaining itself. The irony was sharp. The Habsburg motto, repeated across centuries, was Bella, gerent alii tu Felix Austria noob. Let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry. The idea was that marriages could win empires more safely than battles. For a time, it worked spectacularly. The Habsburgs controlled Spain, Austria, the Netherlands, large swathes of Italy, and even reached into Hungary and Bohemia. But marrying within their own circle eventually undermined the very stability they sought. By the 17th century, the dynasty's heirs were so compromised that the carefully constructed empire crumbled anyway. The great marriage strategy had ended not in peaceful dominance, but in wars of succession, contested thrones, and dying kings without heirs. Perhaps the most tragic detail is how little the family seemed to realize what they were doing. They believed, themselves preserving divine order, maintaining dynastic purity, embodying a sacred mission. To marry outside was weakness. To marry within was loyalty. Science had not yet provided the language of genetics, but lived experience should have offered hints. Babies born frail, princes dying young, kings unable to reproduce. It was all explained away as curses, bad luck, or the will of God. The Habsburgs went to their graves convinced that their jaws were marks of distinction rather than warnings of collapse. And so, while France's Bourbons bankrupted themselves on palaces and Spain's Bourbons bumbled through favorites and farces, The Habsburgs left Europe with a different legacy, a dynasty so committed to itself that it collapsed inward. Their portraits remain: long faces, heavy chins, sad eyes, quiet testimony to what happens when power marries power too many times. Catherine the Great and the endless gossip of her court. While the Habsburgs quietly married themselves into oblivion, Russia took a different approach. It imported foreigners, staged palace coups, and generated gossip on a scale that could fuel entire libraries. At the center of this whirlwind was Catherine II, better remembered as Catherine the Great, a German princess who became Empress of all the Russias and spent decades being slandered in every conceivable way. Born Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst. In 1729, she was a minor Prussian noble with more ambition than prospects. At 16, she was married off to Peter of Holstein-Gottorp, the awkward, toy soldier-obsessed heir to the Russian throne. She converted to Orthodoxy, adopted the name Catherine, and set about the long task of surviving court intrigue. Her husband, the future Peter III, was not an easy man to admire. He idolized Frederick the Great of Prussia, even when Russia was at war with him. He played with toy regiments well into adulthood, forcing courtiers to march around like dolls for his amusement. He neglected Catherine, preferred his mistresses, and once proudly announced his desire to divorce her in favor of a plainer woman he found more entertaining. Catherine, however, was patient. She read voraciously, studied Russian politics, and cultivated allies among the Guards' regiments. She also discreetly took lovers of her own, something Russian gossip never let her forget. By 1762, when Peter III ascended the throne, Catherine was already better connected than her husband. Peter's reign lasted 6 months. His policies, especially his abrupt withdrawal from war against Prussia, alienated nobles and soldiers alike. Catherine seized the moment. With the help of her lover, Grigory Orlov, and his brothers, she orchestrated a coup. Peter was forced to abdicate and, conveniently, died soon after in custody, officially of hemorrhoidal colic, unofficially of strangulation. Catherine was crowned empress. Her reign, stretching for more than 3 decades, was one of expansion, reform, and contradiction. She corresponded with Enlightenment philosophers like Voltaire and Diderot, fancying herself a benevolent monarch. She promoted education, founded schools for noble girls, encouraged vaccination, and attempted legal reforms. At the same time, she expanded serfdom, crushed uprisings, and partitioned Poland 3 times until the state disappeared. Her enlightened ideals always stopped short of threatening aristocratic power. Catherine was pragmatic. Better to quote Montesquieu while tightening control than risk her throne with too much generosity. Russia expanded massively under her watch, into Crimea, the Black Sea, and the Caucasus. She earned the title, the Great, not just from propaganda, but from tangible empire building. But for all her achievements, gossip overshadowed her image. She was a woman ruling in a man's world, and the easiest weapon against her was rumor. Her lovers became legend: Orlov, Potemkin, Zubov, and others. The truth was simple enough. Catherine liked companionship and wasn't inclined to live celibate after Peter's death. But opponents exaggerated, claiming she kept entire stables of lovers, discarded them at whim, and rewarded them with riches. The most infamous slander appeared only after her death: the tale that she died attempting intimacy with a horse. It was, of course, nonsense. She died in 1796 of a stroke. Yet the horse story, grotesque and absurd, stuck in popular memory, spread gleefully by her detractors. It revealed less about Catherine than about the discomfort people felt toward a powerful, sexually autonomous woman. Her relationship with Grigory Potemkin, however, deserves attention. He was a general, statesman, and perhaps the true love of her life. Their partnership blurred lines between romance and politics. Potemkin organized military campaigns, managed territories, and helped shape imperial policy. He was flamboyant, eccentric and prone to grand gestures, supposedly ordering entire villages of facades built to impress Catherine during her tours of Crimea, giving us the phrase Potemkin village. Their bond was stormy but enduring. Even after their romance cooled, they remained close, writing letters filled with affection and trust. Catherine, practical as always, moved on to younger favorites, but none wielded Potemkin's influence. Foreign. Observers alternated between admiration and scandalized whispers. French philosophers adored her as the embodiment of enlightened monarchy. British envoys reported her latest romantic entanglements with thinly veiled smirks. European courts buzzed with speculation. Was she brilliant? Was she debauched? Could she be both? In truth, Catherine balanced both sides. She could discuss Rousseau while plotting territorial annexations. She could build schools while reinforcing serfdom. She could compose flattering correspondence to Voltaire while exchanging love notes with her latest favorite. She was consistent only in her refusal to be constrained. Her private life was, in its own way, a mirror of her political one. Just as she managed ministers and generals with care, she managed lovers. They were given estates, titles, pensions, comfort in exchange for loyalty and discretion. Catherine was no romantic dreamer. She approached relationships with the same pragmatism she brought to empire. If affection faded, she ensured the man was still comfortably housed and financially secure. Critics sneered, of course, but compared. To most monarchs who discarded mistresses without thought, Catherine's arrangements were almost humane. Her death in 1796 closed an era. She had outlasted coups, rebellions, and conspiracies. She left Russia larger, richer, and more centralized than she found it. Yet her reputation was quickly clouded by salacious myth. The horse rumor endured for centuries, overshadowing her actual achievements. It is a fitting irony. One of the most capable rulers of her century remembered less for her policies than for a grotesque fabrication. But perhaps Catherine herself would have smiled wryly. After all, she had always known gossip was a weapon. She had simply chosen to rule anyway. Where the Habsburgs collapsed under their own genetics, Catherine thrived on adaptability. She had begun as a minor German princess and ended as one of Europe's great monarchs. And while whispers tried to reduce her to caricature, the reality was a ruler whose life, like her empire, refused to fit neatly into anyone else's design. The Romanovs and their fatal talent for self-destruction. Catherine the Great left Russia bigger, richer, and more firmly on the European stage than ever before. Unfortunately, her successors managed to waste that momentum with a blend of paranoia, stubbornness, and sheer incompetence that feels almost like dynastic tradition. The Romanovs, like many royal houses, were never content to let prosperity drift quietly along. They had a knack for turning good fortune into crises. Her son Paul the Iron was the first proof. Catherine had little affection for him. She considered him unstable, unfit for rule, and possibly not even the child of her husband Peter III, a rumor she encouraged herself. She preferred to think of him as the product of her own affairs, as if denying her late husband the satisfaction of legitimate paternity. Paul's childhood was bleak. Catherine largely excluded him from power, keeping him at a distance from affairs of state. By the time he inherited in 1796, he had spent decades nursing resentment. His reign lasted only 5 years, but it was long enough to demonstrate every possible flaw. He obsessed over military drill, forcing soldiers to adopt Prussian-style uniforms with powdered wigs and stiff collars that froze in Russian winters. He micromanaged everything, down to the buttons on coats. He reversed many of Catherine's policies simply out of spite. He banned imports of certain British goods, not for strategy, but because he disliked the English. Paranoia consumed him. He changed his sleeping quarters nightly, convinced assassins lurked in the shadows. He issued decrees forbidding nobles from leaving Russia without permission. Unsurprisingly, the nobility turned against him. In 1801, a group of officers broke into his chambers and strangled him. His son, Alexander I, was awakened in the middle of the night and informed that he was now emperor. Alexander the projected charm and mystery. Tall, blue-eyed, and charismatic, he was said to have inherited his grandmother Catherine's wit, but not her decisiveness. He began with reformist energy, discussing constitutions, universities, and administrative modernizations. But the Napoleonic Wars soon consumed his reign. At first he wavered, even allying with Napoleon briefly after the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807. Their meeting, staged on a raft in the middle of a river, was one of history's most awkward displays of bromance. Napoleon called Alexander the most handsome prince in Europe, and Alexander admired Napoleon's energy. But the friendship soured quickly, and by 1812, Russia was preparing for invasion. The campaign that followed destroyed Napoleon and elevated Alexander's status. Moscow burned, the French retreated, and Russia emerged as a savior of Europe. Alexander rode into Paris in 1814, triumphant. At the Congress of Vienna, he styled himself a peacemaker, even proposing a holy alliance of Christian monarchs to govern Europe by piety and fraternity. And yet, his reign ended strangely. He grew increasingly mystical, obsessed with religion and visions. He withdrew from governance, leaving ministers to manage details. In 1825, he died unexpectedly in southern Russia. Rumors spread immediately that he had faked his death and become a hermit monk wandering Siberia in disguise. The stories persisted for decades. Russia loved a mystery, and Alexander's exit was a perfect one. His brother Nicholas I inherited in 1825 after a succession crisis. Another brother, Constantine, had been next in line, but secretly renounced his claim. When Alexander died, confusion erupted, and a group of young officers launched the Decembrist revolt, demanding a constitution. Nicholas crushed them brutally. From the very first days, his reign was one of repression. Nicholas saw himself as the guardian of autocracy. He created a vast censorship network, a secret police known as the Third Section, and banned virtually any discussion of reform. His motto was orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. The empire under him resembled a heavily policed barracks. Unfortunately, he was not particularly good at war. His obsession with military hierarchy did not translate into strategic brilliance. The Crimean War of the 1850s revealed Russian weakness against industrialized powers like Britain and France. Soldiers marched with outdated muskets. Supply lines collapsed. Disease killed more men than combat. Nicholas, faced with humiliation, fell into despair. He died in 1855, possibly from pneumonia, possibly from taking his own life. His son Alexander II entered history as the Tsar Liberator. In 1861, he abolished serfdom, freeing millions of peasants from bondage. The move was momentous, but the details were messy. Serfs gained freedom but not enough land to sustain themselves. They owed redemption payments for decades. The nobility resented the reform, while peasants remained impoverished. Still, Alexander earned a reputation as the most progressive Romanov. In centuries, he pursued further reforms, modernizing the judiciary, expanding education, and easing censorship slightly. But radicals always wanted more. Revolutionary groups multiplied, arguing that gradual reform was too little, too late. Assassination attempts became routine. In 1881, terrorists finally succeeded, hurling bombs at his carriage in St. Petersburg. Mortally wounded, Alexander died just as he was preparing to introduce a limited parliament. His son, Alexander III, was the opposite, reactionary, heavy-handed, and suspicious of change. He was built like a bear, towering and broad, with a famously crushing handshake. Unlike his reformist father, Alexander III cracked down on dissent, promoted Russification, and expanded the secret police. He distrusted parliaments, constitutions, and liberal ideas, preferring stability through fear. Yet privately, he was unusually domestic for a czar. He adored his wife, Maria Feodorovna, and lived a relatively modest family life compared to his predecessors. He disliked St. Petersburg's pomp and preferred simpler surroundings. His reign, though oppressive, was stable, and Russia avoided major wars during his time. He died suddenly in 1894 at only 49, leaving the throne to his 26-year-old son, Nicholas II, who would prove disastrously unprepared. Nicholas, too, was gentle, soft-spoken, and utterly unsuited for autocracy. He admitted as much early on. "I am not prepared to be czar," he confided. "I never wanted to be one." Unfortunately, the Russian throne was not a position one could politely decline. His marriage to Alexandra of Hesse was genuinely affectionate. They were devoted to one another, which was unusual and admirable in royal circles. But Alexandra was shy, awkward in public, and deeply unpopular. Her German origins made her suspect during wartime, and her reliance on mystics would become politically disastrous. Their only son, Alexei, was born with hemophilia, a life-threatening condition where blood would not clot properly. The illness was kept secret but dominated family life. Every fall or bruise could be fatal. Desperate for hope, Alexandra turned to Rasputin, the infamous wandering holy man whose presence at court scandalized the empire. Rasputin seemed able to ease Alexei's suffering, possibly through calming the boy and discouraging harsh medical treatments. But his drunken behavior, lewd reputation, and influence over Alexandra became a national obsession. Rumors of orgies, political manipulation, and corruption swirled endlessly. Nicholas and Alexandra, desperate to protect their son, clung to Rasputin despite the damage to their reputation. Meanwhile, Nicholas's own decisions unraveled the empire. He plunged into the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-05, assuming an easy victory. Instead, Russia's fleet was sunk, its army humiliated, and its prestige shattered. The revolution of 1905 forced Nicholas to concede a parliament, the Duma, but he undermined it constantly, never accepting limits on his authority. World War I proved even worse. Russian armies suffered staggering defeats. Casualties mounted. Food shortages hit cities. Nicholas, against all advice, took personal command of the army, tying his own reputation to a failing war effort. In his absence, Alexandra and Rasputin dominated court politics, deepening resentment. By 1917, strikes and mutinies erupted in Petrograd. Nicholas abdicated, ending more than 3 centuries of Romanov rule. He and his family were placed under house arrest, shuffled from palace to remote town. In July 1918, amid civil war, they were executed in a basement in Ekaterinburg, an end both brutal and final. The Romanovs had always insisted on their divine right, their unique place above ordinary mortals. But their story reads less like divine destiny and more like a manual on how not to govern. Catherine had shown brilliance, but her descendants inherited mostly fear, stubbornness, or incompetence. Paul strangled by his own officers, Alexander I vanishing into legend, Nicholas II walking blindly into revolution. The dynasty could never resist undermining itself. In the end, they were not destroyed simply by revolutionaries. They were destroyed by their own fatal talent for self-destruction. Rasputin, the monk who wouldn't die. If the Romanovs had a flair for self-destruction, then Rasputin was the accelerant. His name alone conjures images of hypnotic eyes, wild beards, and a knack for surviving things that should have killed him. In reality, he was less sorcerer than opportunist, a wandering holy man who stumbled into Russia's most desperate family and became the embodiment of everything the empire despised about its rulers. Grigory Yefimovich Rasputin was born in 1869 in a Siberian village, the sort of place where winters are long, food is scarce, and mystics are taken seriously because no one has anything better to do. As a youth, he showed little sign of future infamy. He was illiterate, awkward, and prone to petty crime. But in his 20s, after a supposed vision of the Virgin Mary, he reinvented himself as a wandering holy man. He cultivated a look, long, unkempt hair, piercing stare, and the kind of beard that makes people assume wisdom even when none is present. He roamed monasteries, prayed with zeal, and developed a reputation as both healer and sinner. He preached repentance while indulging freely in drink and women, which somehow made him more convincing, not less. Contradictions, after all, are magnetic. By 1905, Rasputin had reached St. Petersburg, where he insinuated himself into religious circles. His charisma impressed certain churchmen. His intense, almost hypnotic gaze made people uncomfortable, yet compelled. Rumors spread that he could heal with a touch, that he could see into souls. The Russian elite, exhausted by revolution and anxious for spiritual answers, were primed to listen. Word of Rasputin reached the imperial family just as they faced their most intimate crisis. Tsarevich Alexei's hemophilia threatened the succession daily. Bleeding episodes left him near death. Doctors had little to offer beyond morphine and despair. Alexandra, deeply devout and desperate, was willing to try anything. Enter Rasputin. When Alexei suffered a severe bleeding attack, Rasputin was summoned. Accounts vary. Some say he prayed intensely, others that he calmed Alexandra into stopping. Medical interventions like aspirin, which worsened bleeding. Whatever the mechanism, Alexei improved. To Alexandra, this was divine proof. Rasputin became indispensable. From then on, the imperial family shielded him. He visited their private quarters, blessed their son, and offered counsel. For Alexandra, he was God's messenger. For Nicholas, uncomfortable but loyal to his wife, he was tolerated. For everyone else, he was a scandal made flesh. St. Petersburg society seethed. Here was a filthy Siberian peasant, unwashed, drunken, crude, walking freely into the palace. Rumors multiplied that he seduced noblewomen, that he whispered blasphemies. During prayer, that he held orgies in the name of repentance. Satirical cartoons depicted him with the empress in compromising positions. Pamphlets accused him of controlling government through Alexandra. Rasputin did little to help his image. He drank excessively, groped women in public, and boasted crudely of his access to the Tsarina. Yet when dismissed, he always returned, summoned back whenever Alexei suffered another crisis. His ability to survive disgrace seemed supernatural in itself. Politically, his influence was real but exaggerated. He advised Alexandra on appointments during Nicholas's absence at the front in World War I. Ministers came and went with dizzying speed. Was Rasputin truly deciding policy? Probably not. But the perception that he was, the peasant holy man running Russia, was devastating for the monarchy's credibility. By 1916, with war going badly and famine spreading, Rasputin became the scapegoat for national collapse. Noblemen, politicians, even members of the royal family concluded that he had to go. The plot to kill him has become legend. In December 1916, Prince Felix Yusupov and his allies lured Rasputin to the Moika Palace. They offered cakes and wine, laced with cyanide. Rasputin ate and drank merrily. Hours passed. Nothing happened. Poison, it seemed, was no match for him. Frustrated, Yusupov shot him at close range. Rasputin collapsed. They celebrated until he suddenly stirred, staggered to his feet, and lunged toward the door. Terrified, they fired again, beating him, and finally dumping his body into the frozen Neva River. When found, his corpse showed signs of drowning. Poison, bullets, bludgeoning, and still he seemed to have clung to life until the water claimed him. The murder was meant to save the monarchy. Instead, it highlighted its decay. The Tsar's relatives had conspired to kill his closest advisor. Rumors of Rasputin's supernatural resilience spread even further. If he could not be killed, then perhaps his influence really had been otherworldly. The monarchy, meanwhile, collapsed within 3 months. Rasputin's death did not restore confidence. It only underscored the chaos. By the time Nicholas abdicated, the empire was already beyond repair. Rasputin's legacy is almost mythological. To some, he was a charlatan who exploited a desperate family. To others, a mystic with real healing power. His survival of so many assassination attempts elevated him into folklore, the mad monk who could not be killed. Yet his story is less about him than about what he represented. He was the mirror of Romanov weakness, their desperation, their blindness to public perception. Without Alexei's illness, he would have remained an obscure Siberian wanderer. With it, he became the symbol of an empire's unraveling. It is fitting, in a way, that Rasputin is remembered as much for his death as for his life. The lurid tale of poison, bullets, and icy rivers captures the absurdity of late imperial Russia. A dynasty crumbling, nobles panicking, a mystic refusing to die until the empire itself did. Rasputin's beard, his stare, his outlandish survival, all became shorthand for the final absurd act of Romanov rule. Nicholas II and Alexandra, a love story that ruined an empire. Most royal marriages were dynastic arrangements. 2 names on a treaty, 2 signatures binding nations together. Love was optional, usually accidental, and occasionally a nuisance. Which is what makes Nicholas II and Alexandra such an oddity. They genuinely adored each other. They were faithful, affectionate, and entirely sincere. Unfortunately, their devotion was also catastrophic for the Russian Empire. Nicholas was shy, dutiful, and easily overwhelmed. Alexandra, born Princess Alex of Hesse, was also shy, devout, and hopelessly earnest. They met when they were teenagers, fell deeply in love, and clung to one another with unusual intensity. Against political advice, Nicholas insisted on marrying her. His father, Alexander III, worried about her lack of charm and her fragile health. He wasn't wrong. Still, in 1894, after Alexander III's sudden death, Nicholas became Tsar at 26. Only weeks later, he married Alexandra. The coronation festivities were overshadowed by tragedy when a stampede at the Kodinka field killed over 1,000 people. Nicholas and Alexandra, under pressure, attended a ball that evening anyway, a decision that made them seem indifferent. It was an ominous start to their reign. Their marriage, however, was personally happy. They adored one another with a kind of romantic intensity rare among royals. Their letters are embarrassingly sweet, full of pet names and endless reassurances. They were, in a sense, each other's entire world, which was part of the problem. Both were painfully unsuited to public life. Nicholas was indecisive and reluctant to confront reality. Alexandra was reserved to the point of seeming cold, uncomfortable in Russian society, and too earnest to play the court's political games. She disliked the aristocracy, who returned the feeling enthusiastically. Instead of broadening their social circle, the couple withdrew further into each other. The birth of 4 daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, brought joy but also pressure. Russia expected a male heir. Alexandra, under constant stress, finally gave birth to Alexei in 1904. The relief was immense, until it became clear he suffered from hemophilia. The disease was a cruel twist of dynastic genetics, inherited through Queen Victoria's line. For Alexei, even a minor injury could mean internal bleeding and near death. His condition was kept secret. But it consumed Alexandra. She saw it as her personal failure, a divine punishment, and became desperate to protect him. Nicholas, equally distressed, leaned on her for strength, and she leaned on anyone who offered hope. That, of course, was how Rasputin walked in. The imperial couple's devotion to Rasputin was not rooted in politics, but in parental desperation. When Alexei bled, Rasputin seemed to calm him, sometimes miraculously. Alexandra became convinced that he was sent by God. Nicholas, though uneasy, trusted her judgment. To the outside world, however, it looked like the empire was under the sway of a drunken mystic. The more society mocked Alexandra, the more she clung to Rasputin. The more Nicholas was criticized, the more he retreated into the safety of his family life. Their love made them blind to perception, deaf to warnings, and immovable in their decisions. Nicholas's style of governance compounded the problem. He believed firmly in autocracy, the divine right of the Tsar. But unlike his ancestors, he lacked force of personality. He hated confrontation. Ministers often left meetings without clear decisions because Nicholas simply nodded politely and avoided firm answers. When pressed, he reacted with stubbornness, insisting that yielding meant betraying his oath to God. This combination, rigid principle and weak execution, was disastrous. During the 1905 revolution, after Russia's humiliating defeat by Japan, strikes and protests forced Nicholas to grant a constitution and a parliament, the Duma. But he immediately undermined both, dissolving them when they displeased him, altering election rules, and reasserting autocracy. The concessions satisfied no one. Liberals saw betrayal. Radicals saw opportunity. The monarchy seemed both rigid and incompetent. Through it all, Nicholas and Alexandra retreated further into their bubble. They spent evenings reading aloud, playing with the children and writing affectionate notes. To them, family came first, and the empire was a distant second. Unfortunately, the empire did not feel the same way. By the time World War I began, the couple were already isolated. Alexandra's German birth made her suspect in the public eye. Rumors of treason and espionage swirled, despite her sincere devotion to Russia. Nicholas, eager to prove leadership, took personal command of the army in 1915. It was a catastrophic choice. At the front, he displayed little strategic genius, and defeats piled up. At home, Alexandra ruled as regent, leaning heavily on Rasputin's advice. Ministers came and went in chaotic succession, reinforcing the impression that the empire was run by a mystic and a foreign empress. The strain on the couple grew. Letters from the front reveal Nicholas's exhaustion and Alexandra's desperate reassurances. They loved one another fiercely, but their devotion was no substitute for effective governance. Instead, it blinded them to the reality of collapse. In February 1917, strikes and protests erupted in Petrograd. Soldiers mutinied. Nicholas, as usual, hesitated. He issued half-hearted orders, then rescinded them. By the time he realized the scale of the crisis, it was too late. The Duma refused to support him, generals advised abdication, and Alexandra's reassurances meant little. On March 15th, Nicholas II abdicated for himself and his son, ending more than 300 years of Romanov rule. In exile, their devotion became almost painfully clear. Nicholas chopped wood in the yard. Alexandra tended to Alexei, whose health remained fragile. The daughters sewed and tried to maintain cheer. They were, by all accounts, a loving, close-knit family, just not one equipped to run an empire. When they were executed in July 1918, it was not only the end of the Romanovs, but the final irony of their reign. Their love, genuine and steadfast, had also been their undoing. By clinging to each other, they had shut out the world until it was too late. In the broader sweep of history, Nicholas and Alexandra are often remembered as tragic victims, and in a sense they were. But they were also architects of their own downfall. Their story is not simply one of bad luck or cruel revolution. It is the story of how devotion, when coupled with blindness, can bring down an empire. They were, in their own way, the most faithful married couple on the throne of Russia, and that tragically ruined everything. The Last Supper of history's worst diners. If you've stayed with me this far, you've probably noticed a pattern. History's most powerful people, the ones who owned kingdoms, commanded armies, and claimed God's blessing, were often terrible at something as basic as eating dinner. Their meals were overcooked, their wine was watered down, their banquets were absurd displays of ego, and their stomachs were wrecked by centuries of inbreeding and gout. So perhaps it's fitting to end here, at the great sprawling dining table of history, where the last courses are being served. Let's imagine the scene together. Picture it. A vast medieval hall. Candles gutter in iron chandeliers, dripping wax onto long wooden tables. Nobles fidget in stiff chairs, pretending to enjoy the smell of boiled cabbage. At one end, a king gnaws unhappily at a bone. At the other, a monk ladles porridge with the enthusiasm of a man scooping mud. The air is thick with smoke, sweat, and too many roasted birds. It's not a single court we're visiting now, but all of them. The Plantagenets of England slouch next to the Bourbons of France. The Habsburgs arrive, waddling in with their famously protruding jaws. The Romanovs drift in late, looking worried and bringing Rasputin along, who immediately dunks a hand into the wine jug. Catherine the Great pulls up a chair, smiling politely, while assessing which men she might take as lovers before dessert. Everyone, it seems, has gathered for one last supper, a symbolic feast of dynasties. The dishes arrive, and they are predictably disappointing. A boar's head, roasted until it resembles an oversized lump of coal. A platter of swan, its feathers reattached for dramatic flair, though now they smell faintly of smoke. Pies stuffed with questionable meats, some wriggling slightly, because refrigeration is still several centuries away. Trays of fish, their eyes cloudy and untrustworthy. The nobles murmur appreciation, but their faces tell the truth. They are hungry for status, not flavor. The peasants, of course, are absent from the table. They are outside, gnawing crusts of black bread, and wondering how many more generations will pass before bread stops being mostly sawdust and weeds. One might expect arguments to break out. After all, these dynasties spent centuries at war. Yet around this dreamlike table, their grievances blur together. The Bourbons complain that their cooks are lazy. The Habsburgs mumble through their famous jawlines about how hard it is to chew. Swan. The Romanovs sigh that the wine is too weak, and where on earth is Rasputin now? He is, naturally, already under the table. For once, the kings and queens are united in misery, victims not of rebellion or revolution, but of dinner. If you listen closely, you can almost hear their private thoughts. Edward II, staring glumly at the cabbage, remembers that he would rather be with his male favorites in the stables. Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, whispers to a servant to fetch his chamber pot, since his intestines are never quite cooperative. Marie Antoinette pushes a pie away and wonders why people think she said, "Let them eat cake," when clearly no one here should be eating any of this. Catherine the Great stirs her soup and recalls with some irritation that she tried to bring potatoes into Russia, but peasants refused, convinced they were poisonous. Nicholas II sits quietly, too polite to complain, his wife Alexandra squeezing his hand anxiously while sneaking glances at Rasputin, who is now attempting to charm a bowl of porridge. It is, in other words, a perfect summary of history. Rulers, surrounded by food, yet never quite enjoying it, each lost in their own petty worries. The waiters of this surreal banquet are monks, shuffling silently in their habits, setting down bowls of watery broth. They look unimpressed with their charges, as if to say, "You people conquered half the world, and yet this is what you eat." The nobles pretend not to notice. Nobles, after all, were experts at pretending, and perhaps that is what ties all of this together. The pretending. pretending that bad food is a sign of sophistication, pretending that stale bread is an honor to receive, pretending that banquets filled with grotesque dishes prove divine right rather than bad taste, pretending, always pretending, until the peasants stop pretending along with them and begin sharpening guillotines. As the final courses arrive, the mood grows drowsy. The wine is thin but plentiful. The nobles are stuffed, though not satisfied. Conversation drifts into slurred recollections. Someone recalls a joust from years ago. Another brags about a hunt. Someone else insists that their family line is descended from Alexander the Great, though no one believes it. The hall is heavy with smoke, laughter, and the dull ache of indigestion. One by one, heads droop. Even monarchs, it turns out, are not immune to food comas. It's tempting, of course, to laugh at them, and we should, gently. They lived lives of absurd privilege, yet were constantly betrayed by their own cooks, doctors, and egos. They hoarded gold but lacked salt. They commanded armies but could not command their own digestion. They claimed crowns by divine right, yet often died from something as mundane as spoiled meat. But there is also something strangely human about it. Strip away the titles and jewels, and you find the same discomforts that plague ordinary people. Indigestion, insecurity, a longing for comfort food that never quite arrives. Kings or peasants, we are all at the mercy of our stomachs. As the banquet winds down, torches sputter. The hall grows darker. The nobles slump in their chairs, crowns tilting, jewels glinting faintly. The monks clear away dishes, stacking plates with quiet efficiency. Rasputin snores beneath the table, a final indignity. And slowly, silence settles. The great families of history, Bourbons, Habsburgs, Plantagenets, Romanovs, fade into shadow. Their crowns slip, their jewels vanish into the gloom, their names dissolve like sugar in wine. All that remains is the table itself, scarred by centuries of knives, soaked with spilled ale, worn smooth by elbows. A table that has seen too much, held too little nourishment, and endured long after its diners have gone. So here, perhaps, is the final lesson. History's banquets were not just about food. They were about power, vanity, desperation, and the endless theater of monarchy. The meals were symbols, not sustenance, and symbols, as we know, do not fill bellies. The peasants understood this well. For them, bread was life. Gruel was survival. A rare bit of meat was treasure. Their tables may have been poor, but they were honest. The nobles' tables were rich but hollow, their dishes elaborate but joyless. And when the hollow outweighs the honest for too long, revolutions tend to follow. Now the hall is empty. The candles gutter out. The long table sits alone in the dark, waiting for the next generation of fools to take their seats. And we, fortunate enough to live in a time when food is a little safer, a little tastier, and a lot less likely to involve swan pie, can simply smile faintly and close the book. So if you're listening now, drifting into that half-sleep haze, take comfort. No matter how badly your dinner went tonight, no matter if the soup was bland or the bread was burnt, it was almost certainly better than what most kings and queens ate for centuries. History's rulers may have had crowns, armies, and jewels, but you have edible food, a warm place to rest, and hopefully the luxury of quiet. And in the end, that might be the greater kingdom. So let the candles go out. Let the hall fade away, and let the long, disastrous banquet of history drift into silence. Good night.